Friday is a momentous day in the cycle of the week for WoW, because either on Friday before the weekend or on Monday right after the weekend is when we get any communication from Blizzard on whether or not we are going to get any balance tuning at the next weekly reset. And that's exactly what happened this Friday. We got the announcement from Blizzard of more balance tuning coming next reset. And the first effect of these changes touches what has been a thing since week 2 of this season in Mythic Plus. We can actually go on to week 3 and even to week 4. Why not to week 5 and then 6 and then 7 and then 8 and then even this current week, which is Unholy Death Knight, being far ahead of any other DPS in Mythic Plus, especially when you take one of the larger Mythic Plus keys in terms of pulls, in terms of amount of enemies you get to fight, like for example Cinder Brumidery. This is a pretty common occurrence. You see the Unholy DK gapping quite a lot, pretty much any other spec, and then usually the second one is gonna be balanced, being slightly ahead of the third one. It is a pretty common sight, and that's what we get to nerf first for Unholy DK. Your Pact of the Sun lane now stores 25% of all shadow damage into the Blood Beast instead of 50%. Now, while many players have this idea that the Blood Beast, of course, is doing a gazillion, quintillion, trillion damage, actually, when you think about it, when you actually look at the results of all of these DKs gapping the other DPS players, the Blood Beast is doing 14% of your damage, this one is doing 12.9%, this one is doing 10.4%. So yes, while the explosion itself is definitely quite large, and it's quite a sight to see whenever the Blood Life is popping in terms of total damage every time, it will end up averaging some 3-ish% overall damage nerf for Unholy, and of course specifically for AoE. In this case, for example, Unholy would be nerfed by about 180k DPS. So yeah, the result is, it doesn't matter. Unholy is still going to be the highest damage dealing AoE spec in Mythic Plus. Instead now it won't gap the other DPS specs by like 15%, it will only gap them by 12%. That's the difference in Mythic Plus. Actually, the buff also goes to Army of the Damned, the Magus Frostbolt, as well as Raid Abomination. Now this one, of course, doesn't really have an effect when it comes to Mythic Plus, because in Mythic Plus you don't really play with these talents. However, while you don't play with these talents in Mythic Plus, you do play with these talents, or rather one of these talents in the raid. So this one getting buffed by 30% overall gets you a 1.5% damage buff in a single target, which is where you were weaker at overall. Let's just say that if we were expecting an actual AoE nerf for Unholy, it should have been something slightly larger if we wanted to entertain any idea that it might have lost its spot in Mythic Plus as their meta comp spec. This one is not enough. Now we have a buff instead, and it goes right at the bottom. This time it's Havoc. Havoc gets a flat 4% damage buff to all abilities. So this is actually overall a 3-ish% overall buff, because of course all abilities won't count your auto attacks, won't count your enchants, your procs of your trinkets and whatnot, just your actual abilities. So it's a 3% buff for Havoc. Not much to say. Havoc wasn't doing particularly well in the raid. Havoc also wasn't doing particularly well in Mythic Plus either. So it's just a buff to one of the bottom performing specs. That's really what it is. We can pretty much repeat this exact same sentence for Feral. Feral gets a 3% buff, but also to their auto attacks, not just to their abilities. So more or less the same situation Havoc Demon Hunter is in. Admittedly, Feral's AoE has actually been overall stronger than Havoc. So this is actually a pretty good buff in Mythic Plus. If anyone actually cared about playing Feral, their buff is actually quite strong now in Mythic Plus, given that they were already doing quite well. It's unfortunate that one of the other things you have to do in Mythic Plus is not just compete with the other DPS specs, but also compete with your same class members, in this case Balanced Druid, which is one of the currently meta specs in Mythic Plus, which makes it even harder for Feral to find a spot. Now on to some danger, back to the underperforming specs. It is the danger of Augmentation. Because Augmentation receives another flat buff. This is another flat 15% damage buff. Obviously, Augmentation's value isn't just in their damage they do, it's also, of course, in their buffs. So, being buffed by 15% in damage isn't actually the same as getting a 15% overall buff. This is closer to a 5-ish% damage buff in single target and a 7 or so % buff in AoE. So unfortunately, we have to say that unfortunately with this buff, Augmentation is now close to reaching the level of you're not trolling if you're trying to play one. That's right. It will now no longer be completely unspeakable to see an Augmentation evoker in the raid or in Mythic Plus. Now, admittedly, somewhat similar to Feral, currently Devastation is doing quite well in the raid. We just had a video talking about in our weekly raid recap that perhaps actually overall the more complete in terms of damage profile spec doing the best in the raid right now is Devastation. So you have little reason to actually switch back to Augmentation given how well Devastation is doing in the raid, and also in Mythic Plus, despite not being meta, Devastation still has very good, very strong AoE already. So pretty much only the old school one-trick pony Augmentations who lament the days they got themselves a title leeching off this OP spec back in Dragonflight, those are pretty much the only ones who actually will try to go back and play Augmentation after these buffs. Then we have a buff, which isn't actually a buff, it's a buff to Frost Mage, and this is to Spellslinger, right? This would be a buff if it wasn't that Spellslinger is completely unplayed for Frost. Yes, technically, that's the idea. Let's buff Spellslinger so it becomes played, right? Not really, because this will amount to a 2 to 3% damage buff to Spellslinger, and Spellslinger is still like 10% damage behind Frostfire. So it will still take quite a lot more for this to become competitive with Frostfire for Frost Mage. Down the line again, when we talk about the underperforming ones, a pretty sizable buff this time goes the way of Ret Paladin. Because Ret Paladin gets 80% more damage to Blade of Justice, 50% more damage to Divine Arbiter, and then 10% more damage to Final Verdict. Now, it's quite simple here to see why this is really not much in AoE, because you're wondering, hold on a second, Ret Paladin's AoE is already very strong. In fact, if one of the other specs start losing out in value, perhaps, for example, one was thinking after the nerfs to Unholy, maybe the next one in line could have been Ret, because of the just damage they were doing up to now. Well, this buff doesn't really have too much of an effect in Mythic Plus, of course, because buffing Final Verdict in Mythic Plus is not really amounting to much. Buffing your Blade of Justice, only the Blade of Justice part, doesn't really amount to much in AoE, and buffing Divine Arbiter by 50% doesn't really amount to much because you don't even play Divine Arbiter in Mythic Plus. Where the buff is going to have more value is, of course, in the raid. We are looking at a pure single target fight, so just buffing Final Verdict by 10% is a 2.2% damage increase, buffing Divine Arbiter by 50% is a 1.2% damage increase, and then buffing Blade of Justice by 80%. It's another 2.4% damage increase, so it's a total of 6-ish% more damage in pure single target for Ret. So this should actually push up Ret by quite a bit in terms of damage results in here. Just if we look at the median being 2,320,000, a 6% buff of this, it's like 135,000, so they should go up to 2,450,000 at the very minimum, which should be around here actually in terms of median percentile with just a 6% buff. Now we have actually though a break talking about DPS. We have to break and talk about healers because Holy Priest gets buffed by a flat 4%. Holy was our, our odd one out when we were talking about the performance of the healers, as, we were mentioning how close now after the nerfs of these three became, and still now the gap between these three and these three was now much smaller. Even here, if you see the median difference, we are talking about 60k DPS. 60k is like 2.7% difference between these three and these three. But Holy was lagging a bit more behind. So now, with this 4% buff, everything should be equalized. Because 4% of 2.5 million, it's just 100k. It's just 100k HPS given to Holy. So they would go to about 2.660 million, which is basically where these guys are. This should completely equalize the gap of healers, no longer having the outlier of Holy at the bottom, and make pretty much all of the healers within 3% healing of each other in the raid. Of course, this is completely irrelevant in Mythic Plus, as Holy Priest is nowhere near being competitive. The last of the buffs is a single target focused kind of buff to both of the last of the two underperformers below the bottom line, Arms and Fury. Because they both have their Blade Storm buffed by 30%. So you see here, Blade Storm getting buffed by 30%. This is like a 2.5% buff for Arms. Also, Blade Storm here being buffed by 30%. This is actually closer to a 4% buff for Fury. In this case, of course, it's closer to having more value since it's not nearly pure single target Blade Storm, since this is in a Galdiwix fight with a whole bunch of adds. So in pure single target, it's closer to a 2 to 2.5% damage buff. So after all of the buffs are done, we can see that this spec was buffed, this was buffed, this was buffed, this was buffed, and these two were buffed. So basically most of the specs in the bottom 8 practically have all been buffed. So we can say once again this had to be a more raid focused kind of buffs, especially considering how many of these were single target only, right? Or at least focused on single target. Ret was focused on single target. For example, both of the warrior buffs were focused on single target. The buff, the actual buff to Unholy, despite being nerfed in AoE, the buff was also focused on single target. So we can say definitely a more raid focused set of balance tuning, even though I guess we can say the one nerf was centered in Mythic Plus, because Unholy was the one actually being nerfed in AoE. So this is what we have for this weekend of balance tuning for the next reset. A series of single target focus buffs for the raid for quite a few specs, as well as the buff for healers that should normalize now the gap between all of the healers' performances in the raid, and the AoE nerf of Unholy for Mythic Plus, which won't really amount to much. Unholy will still gap the other DPS specs, not just by nearly as much. So, if you were wondering, perhaps it is time to start thinking about an alternative to the spot of the DPS of Unholy in the meta comp. No. It's still there. It's still gonna be one of the picks in Mythic Plus, just not doing nearly as much damage. Precisely 3% less damage than before, but still very powerful. So, with this done and said, we can now leave each other on this weekend, on this Saturday. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, wind. Okay. We have a break in the pattern. It's not about raining or sun anymore. Now we have wind in the background. It's fine. Nice change of pace.